Caleb clinked his glass and grinned. Nora abandoned them when things collapsed. Forks paused midair while Rosa blinked hard behind thick reading glasses. Javier studied his stew like answers might rise with the steam. Laughter sputtered along the table, nervous and cruel in the chandelier's rain. I tasted rosemary and rust, heat crawling up my neck in strips. "To the only child who never called back," Caleb added, teeth shining. A cousin snorted, then stared at his plate as if ashamed. I set my napkin down and pushed back from the table slowly. The chair legs screeched, a barn animal refusing to be dragged farther. I walked out without permission, door-breathing cold night against my burning face. In the car, silence took me like cold water swallowing fire. My thumbs opened the banking app I'd guarded for years. Transfers lined the screen, every month, labeled Parents' Care Account. Grocery deliveries, prescription refills, home nurse payments, quiet gifts with digital receipts. I scrolled farther, seeing late-night wire confirmations alongside old apologies. "You're busy, sis. I've got them," Caleb had texted after Father's Day. I searched messages for gratitude and found practice charm instead. A screenshot of Rosa's inhaler delivery anchored July, proof against his smear. My breath steadied like someone stitching a wound without anesthesia. I drove to my apartment, every stoplight blinking red like a question. Inside, I spread paper on the counter beneath the kitchen lamp. The envelope smelled like glue and winter, the scent of paid obligations. Pharmacy slips confirmed pickups already charged to my card, neat and unquestioned. Then I saw cash withdrawals labeled meds, same days as auto refills posted. Memos changed mysteriously, groceries became gas, then Caleb mileage, then nothing at all. Utility late fees surfaced despite the auto pay I'd set in spring. Rosa had mentioned cutting pills last month, stretching until Friday. Voice light. Javier's quiet had grown heavier, coughs hidden behind folded newspaper edges. My hands shook, not from anger, but recognition finally choosing daylight. I wrote one line slow enough to feel each letter. "He's rewriting me." My phone buzzed and rattled the counter like news with dirty shoes. A voicemail waited from a number saved under Alan Pierce, attorney. I pressed play and leaned into the speaker, heart thudding hard. "Caleb," Alan's voice said, clipped and professional, "we need you in tomorrow." Papers whispered as he continued, "Bring records for the caregiver accounting, including withdrawals and reimbursements." The message ended without warmth, a door closing on practiced excuses. I stood still, listening to the refrigerator hum like a courtroom air vent. My reflection in the microwave looked older, honest, and past negotiation. Something in me clicked into place like a lock meeting its key. I didn't answer. Caleb's lies tonight, I documented them. Morning arrived thin and gray, the kind of light that forgives nothing. I brewed coffee strong enough to scrub last night from my tongue. The apartment smelled like toast and paper, like work more than comfort. I lined receipts across the table, months building a quiet wall. My hands moved steady while my heartbeat argued for panic. I called Rosa, voice light as if weather were our only grief. "You sleeping all right, Mommy?" I asked, counting breaths between her pauses. "Better lately," she said, "but I'm stretching the pills again, Hija." Something inside me tilted. The cups clinked too loud. "Caleb's helping," she added quickly, like kindness must be defended. I opened the delivery dashboard and scrolled through completed orders. Every week showed groceries, staples, and the same inhaler rotating through. Photos confirmed doorstep drops, brown bags sweating under porch light. I zoomed on signatures and saw Javier's shaky letters twice. But pharmacy notes showed cash pickup, days I'd prepaid without fail. The mismatch pulsed like bruise and siren in the same place. I called the pharmacy and asked for a verification printout. The tech read dates, amounts, and the word paid with bored certainty. "Who picked up last Tuesday?" I asked, steadying my voice carefully. "Man signed C. Delgado," she answered, tapping a keyboard like it mattered less. I texted Caleb a single line and a fresh transfer. "Refill Rosa inhaler," I wrote, keeping it simple and cold. He replied 2 minutes later with a thumbs up and a heart. The bank pinged again, ATM withdrawal flag near the casino exit. I breathed in through my nose until my chest stopped burning. The phone rang. It was Cousin Mateo whispering gossip like incense. "He said you left them when the bills stacked," Mateo murmured. "Said you changed numbers and lost your way." I thanked him and hung up before my throat unraveled. Lies were loud last night. Today, only math would speak. At lunch, I walked the long way past our old school. The gym roof flashed sunlight like an eye that finally recognized me. We used to race home for boleros on Rosa's radio. Caleb would bow grandly and steal the first empanada. I remembered promising him my allowance for his field trip fee. He promised to pay back with chores he never started. Somehow that small debt had grown legs and learned spreadsheets. I pressed my palms against cold railing until memory loosened. People choose their stories, I thought. Some choose the ones that absolve. I chose the one with receipts, even if it broke me. Back home, I listened to Alan's voicemail again. Slower. "Bring records for the caregiver accounting," repeated clean as courtroom light. He hadn't called me, but the message felt addressed anyway. I printed statements, circled withdrawals, and clipped every delivery photo together. On the last page, I wrote 3 names like an oath: Rosa, Javier, and the woman I refused to let vanish myself. My voice tested the quiet, almost gentle, almost steel. "Caleb," I said to no one, "you're done editing me." I capped the pen and folded everything into one hard folder. I have to know the truth. The next few days felt like walking through fog that only I could see. Every message from Caleb carried a false warmth, and every word from Mom sounded rehearsed. I began collecting the small things he didn't notice, details that didn't fit his version of me. The first was the pharmacy report that arrived in my inbox like a quiet confession. Each refill confirmed payment through my account, but handwritten notes marked "picked up by C. Delgado." I laid the pages flat on the counter, the ink smudged slightly as if guilt itself had touched them. The second clue came from the electric bill, a late notice despite my autopay history. Caleb had been intercepting the mail, maybe even changing addresses, I realized. A small lie repeated enough times grows roots deep as truth. At night I couldn't sleep. I'd stare at the ceiling fan turning slow, feeling the world spin beneath its blades. My mind replayed the dinner, Rosa's silence, Javier's distant stare, Caleb's smirk polished by years of practice. I thought of how easily people believed him, how confidence disguises corruption better than any disguise. Once, when we were teenagers, he'd copied my essay and won a school contest. Dad had framed the certificate in the living room, proud as sunlight. Caleb never corrected him, and I never spoke up. Maybe that was where it began, the practice of letting him take credit for goodness while I disappeared quietly behind it. On the third morning, I stopped waiting for answers to fall into my lap. I opened a new account under Mom's name and set digital alerts for every transaction. The first withdrawal came just 4 hours later from Caleb's neighborhood ATM. I didn't even feel anger, just a kind of cold recognition. I froze the card and texted him casually. "Hey, did you withdraw for groceries?" I just saw the charge. He replied almost instantly. "Yeah, got dinner stuff for them. I'll send receipts later." He wouldn't. He never did. That afternoon, I drove to the old neighborhood to visit Rosa and Javier. The house looked smaller now, tired around the edges. The curtains were closed, though. The day was bright. Rosa opened the door, smile brittle as lace. "Ay, mija, you didn't tell me you were coming," she said. Her voice carried the faint tremor of someone afraid to be caught grateful. I hugged her carefully, feeling the thinness of her frame, and stepped inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. "Where's Caleb?" I asked. "Work," she answered too fast. On the counter sat an empty prescription bottle with last month's date. My heart folded in on itself. After tea, I excused myself to the living room. On the wall, the framed certificate from years ago still hung crooked, the one Caleb had stolen credit for. I straightened it with steady hands, watching my reflection ripple across the glass. My phone buzzed again, another bank alert. A second withdrawal, this time larger, labeled care expenses. I looked toward the hallway where Rosa hummed softly and whispered to myself, "He's still at it." As I left, I kissed her cheek and promised to visit more often. "We miss you when you're gone," she said, eyes tired but kind. "Caleb says you're so busy now." I smiled for her sake. "Not anymore," I said. She didn't understand what I meant, but she squeezed my hand before I walked away. Outside, the evening air felt heavy but clean, like truth forming in the lungs before it becomes a storm. I gripped the steering wheel and made a quiet promise into the windshield's reflection. No more silence. He's had his version long enough. That night, I spread every windshield document across my floor like a map of deceit. The receipts, the pharmacy slips, the screenshots, each one a piece of my brother's story unraveling. The noise from the city below my window felt far away, muffled by the weight of what I now knew. I drew lines with a red pen between the charges, circling the matching dates. Grocery withdrawals on the same days as restaurant tabs, care expenses aligning perfectly with his weekend getaways. He wasn't caring for them. He was feeding his own lifestyle and dressing it up as sacrifice. For years, he'd spun tales about me, abandoning them, while draining what I gave. It wasn't just theft, it was character assassination with an alibi. I sat back, exhausted, and stared at the ceiling. Fear tried to whisper that I should stop, that exposing him would break whatever fragile peace still lived in our family. But then I thought of Rosa cutting pills to stretch the prescription I'd paid for, and the thought hardened inside me. Like cement. I opened my laptop and started a new spreadsheet labeled Truth. I logged every transaction, every missing receipt, every inconsistent signature. The work steadied me. Line by line, the fog lifted and became evidence. Around midnight, my phone lit up with Caleb's name. I let it ring out, then played the voicemail. "Hey, sis," he said, voice sugary and tired. "I know you've been checking on stuff. Look, I'm doing what I can, all right? Things are tight. Don't make it harder." There it was, the casual guilt, the practiced deflection. He always assumed the world bent toward his excuses. I saved the message. Tomorrow, it would join the rest. Sleep never came, but clarity did. At dawn, I sat at my small kitchen table with coffee gone cold and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The next move wouldn't be emotional, it would be methodical. I drafted an email to Alan Pierce, Dad's old attorney, requesting a meeting. The subject line was simple: caregiver. Accounting inquiry. I attached 3 PDFs, proof of misused funds, missing receipts, and conflicting withdrawals. Then, I hit send before doubt could speak. By noon, Alan replied, "Come in Friday morning. Bring originals. This may go deeper than you think." The words chilled me but also lit a spark somewhere behind my ribs. "Deeper than you think." I whispered the phrase like a dare. If Caleb had forged anything under Mom or Dad's name, that meant legal ground, not just betrayal. Later that evening, I drove past the casino listed on his statements. The neon glow bled across the street like spilled oil, slick and cold. I could almost see him there, laughing, spinning stories over cards, spending what was meant to keep Rosa breathing steady. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling anger sharpen into focus. Revenge wasn't fire anymore, it was precision. When I reached home, the answering machine blinked again. Rosa's voice filled the room, soft, unaware. "Mi amor, Caleb. Said you might stop helping. Are you all right? He worries about you." My throat closed around her words. He was still writing my role in their lives, even while I gathered the truth that would undo him. I pressed my forehead against the fridge, the metal cool against hot skin. "You won't worry long, Mom," I whispered. "You'll see what he's done. You'll see me." I gathered the folder, slid the last of the evidence inside, and zipped it shut. My reflection in the window didn't look broken anymore, it looked ready. Whatever waited behind Alan Pierce's office door, I would face it. For Rosa, for Javier, for the years stolen by his lies. I had lived in the background long enough. Friday morning came with heavy clouds, the kind that pressed the sky low enough to touch. I dressed neatly but plain dark jeans, gray sweater, nothing Caleb could twist into arrogance. The drive to Alan Pierce's office cut through wet streets that reflected the city in broken pieces. My hands gripped the folder on the passenger seat like a weapon wrapped in paper. Alan's building was older, all dark wood and framed certificates that whispered authority. The receptionist recognized my name and led me in without delay. Alan stood as I entered, tall and silver-haired, his expression unreadable. "Nora," he said, shaking my hand. "Your father always said you had his patience." I gave a thin smile. "I'm afraid patience is all I've had left lately." We sat across from each other, the air between us thick with expectation. I laid the folder on his desk, every page organized and labeled. "These are the last 6 months of caregiver transactions," I said. "All the payments came from my account. But the receipts." He raised a hand gently. "Let me look." He examined the documents with slow precision, his brow tightening the farther he read. After a few minutes, he leaned back, sighing. "This is not what we were told." "We?" I asked. "Your brother and I," he replied carefully. "He handles communication with the court's guardianship registry." The words struck like a bell inside my chest. "He what?" Alan rubbed his temple. "Your father's health account was placed under joint monitoring years ago, after his first surgery. Your brother volunteered for administrative duties. You," being out of state, were listed as alternate. I stared at him. Alternate, I repeated, meaning invisible until convenient. His eyes flicked toward me, sympathetic but firm. I'm not defending him, Nora, but you should know this: there's a required annual accounting of care funds. Caleb hasn't submitted one in 2 years. I felt the air thin. And no one noticed? Not until the court flagged it last week, he said, leaning forward. That's why I called him in. I watched the rain streak down the window, the gray world outside matching the color of my thoughts. What happens if he can't? Account for the funds? I asked quietly. Restitution, in mild cases, Alan said. But if intent is proven, he paused. It becomes misappropriation. He turned a page, his finger stopping at a line of handwriting. Look at this memo. Different ink, different pen pressure. I'd say someone edited after signing. My stomach turned cold. Are you saying it's forged? He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Alan closed the folder gently. I'm assigning my paralegal to gather statements from the pharmacies and service providers. We'll request full bank copies directly. If your brother's been misusing funds, we'll find it. I nodded, my voice quiet but steady. I want transparency for my parents, not revenge. He studied me for a moment. The two don't always stay separate, he said softly. When I left the office, the clouds finally broke open, rain hammering the streets like applause after truth. I stood under the awning, folder, clutched to my chest, feeling both exposed and alive. Caleb's lies had been architecture built high, clean, convincing. But today, I'd seen the cracks. The foundation was shifting. I pulled out my phone and texted him one line. Alan called me in too. Within seconds, the typing dots appeared, then vanished. For the first time, Caleb didn't have words. The weekend crawled by, each hour dragging a new thought behind it. I couldn't focus on anything. Music felt too loud, and silence too sharp. When Monday finally arrived, I met Alan's paralegal, a quiet woman named Sophie Vega, in a small records room that smelled like old paper and lemon polish. She spread folders across the table, each one marked with dates and codes I didn't yet understand. We pulled bank statements from both caregiver accounts, she said, tapping a folder. Your deposits match the transfers, but here these withdrawals don't trace back to your parents' expenses. She flipped a page toward me, and my heart sank. Caleb's signature appeared beside one labeled reimbursement, groceries and gas. The timestamp placed him 40 miles away at a casino I'd driven past days earlier. Sophie looked up, eyes steady. You were right to come forward. I leaned closer, tracing the ink with my fingertip. He's been using their care money for himself, I whispered, and covering it with fake reimbursements. Sophie nodded. It's common in family guardian cases. Emotional leverage makes oversight disappear. She clicked through another file. Look at this, he logged 2 grocery purchases in one day. The totals are identical, but the receipts differ. One real, one fabricated. I sat back, throat tight. He's not just lying, I said. He's documenting his lies. Alan entered halfway through our review, his coat still wet from the rain. We've confirmed discrepancies, he said, voice brisk but heavy. Caleb reimbursed himself for cash errands totaling nearly $8,000. The court will demand explanation. I blinked. And if he can't explain, he'll have to return every cent, plus penalties, Alan said. But that's the simple version. If intent's clear, it escalates. He met my eyes. It looks clear. We spent hours sorting the paperwork into evidence, stacks one labeled verified, another suspicious. By the time we finished, my fingers smelled like toner and tension. Alan packed everything into a sealed envelope for the court's audit request. You've done well, he said as we walked toward the door. But prepare yourself. When people lose control of their story, they fight harder. His words lingered long after I left. Outside, I sat in my car, engine idling, the rain soft against the windshield. I opened my phone and scrolled through old photos of Caleb and me birthdays, family barbecues, holidays where his grin looked genuine. In every image, he stood just a little in front, as if the camera belonged to him. Maybe it always had. I thought about what Alan said, about stories. Caleb had spent years perfecting his version, shaping me into the villain who left home. But he'd underestimated one thing. I'd learned to build mine with proof. That night, I sent Rosa a message asking to visit again. She replied quickly, saying Caleb had been busy with bank people. My pulse kicked. He was already scrambling. I texted Alan. He knows something's moving. He responded within minutes. Good. Let him feel the floor shift. Later, alone at my desk. I listened again to Caleb's old voicemail, the one where he pretended to care. I let his voice play softly while highlighting evidence against him. Each word he spoke became another reason not to stop. "Don't make it harder," he'd said. I smiled bitterly. "I'm not making it harder," I murmured to the empty room. "I'm just making it true." Then I slid the last paper into its folder and sealed it shut, the click of the clasp sounding like a promise. The day of the audit meeting arrived with a gray sky and wind that smelled like rain waiting to fall. I drove to Alan's office early. My stomach twisted into a knot too tight for breakfast. The conference room was small but sterile, its long table gleaming under fluorescent light. On one side, Alan and Sophie arranged binders in perfect rows. Across from them sat Caleb, wearing a navy suit that didn't quite fit, his jaw locked in that familiar defiant grin. When he saw me walk in, the grin faltered just slightly. "Didn't think you'd show," he said under his breath. "I never stopped showing," I replied quietly. I sat down opposite him, the folder of evidence a silent wall between us. Alan began with formality. "Thank you both for attending. Today we'll review the financial accountings required under the guardianship order of Javier and Rosa Delgado." His tone was professional, but I caught the edge beneath it. He flipped open a binder, his pen ready. "Caleb, we'll start with your reimbursements for the past year. Please explain this first entry. Groceries and medical supplies, $480. Caleb cleared his throat, pulling a wrinkled receipt from his folder. "Yeah, that's from the pharmacy near Mom's place." Sophie took it, compared it against a record. "This receipt," she said, "matches one already submitted under Nora's payments. It's duplicate." Alan looked up. "So you claimed reimbursement for something already covered?" Caleb's smile returned, strained. "Must be a mix-up." They went line by line, and the mix-ups multiplied. 2 gas receipts identical to restaurant charges, mileage claims for weekends he'd been out of town, and withdrawals logged as emergency cash. Each contradiction chipped away at his composure. I stayed silent, watching him shrink behind the mask he'd worn since childhood. The final blow came when Sophie placed the care agreement form on the table, a document Caleb had used to justify larger reimbursements. "Notice the signature date," she said. Alan leaned forward. "This was signed 3 days after your father's hospitalization, when he was under morphine." Caleb shifted in his chair, voice cracking. "He told me to handle things, he wanted me to take care of it." Alan's voice sharpened. "He couldn't have legally signed this, which means someone else did." The room fell into stillness heavy enough to hear the clock ticking on the wall. Caleb looked at me then, eyes flickering with something that almost resembled fear. "You think you're saving them," he said, low and bitter. "But you're just tearing what's left apart." I met his stare. "I'm not tearing anything," I said softly. "I'm just cleaning the mess you made." Alan closed the file with a decisive thud. "That's enough. The audit's complete." He turned toward Caleb. "Expect correspondence from the court. There will be restitution and potential legal consequences." Caleb's hand slammed against the table. "You think this makes her better than me?" His voice cracked under its own weight. "She left them." "I never left." I cut in, my words sharp as glass. "I sent money, food, care, everything. You turned it into a lie because you couldn't stand being second." His face went pale, the bravado bleeding out. Alan's calm tone broke the tension. "That'll be all for today." When the meeting ended, Caleb didn't look at me again. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and walked out, shoulders hunched, the storm finally catching up to him. I stayed behind a moment longer, staring at the stack of binders between us. Sophie touched my arm gently. "You did what most people can't," she said. "You faced family truth." I nodded slowly, feeling both emptied and anchored. The storm outside finally broke, the rain hammering the windows as if the world itself was washing something clean. The rain hadn't stopped by the time I reached my car. Water streaked down the windshield like tears the sky refused to swallow. I sat there for a long while, gripping the steering wheel, unable to turn the key. The truth was out now, cold, sharp, irreversible. But instead of triumph, all I felt was the weight of what it had cost to get here. I replayed Caleb's face in the conference room, the way his hands shook, his voice cracking under the lies he'd built. Part of me wanted to hate him, but another part, the smaller, stubborn part that still remembered our shared childhood, only felt hollow. Betrayal isn't always a clean wound. It festers, then fades, leaving something you can't easily name. When I finally started the car, the radio flickered to life, playing an old bolero Dad used to hum while trimming the rose bushes. The melody cut through me like sunlight through fog. I thought of Rosa's soft voice, her trembling hands clutching teacups, unaware of the storm that had been swirling around her. She'd been caught between our truths, loyal to both children even when one was quietly bleeding her dry. I knew I'd have to tell her soon. I didn't know how. That night, I went home and poured myself a drink, sitting by the window while the storm rolled on. My reflection in the glass looked older, sharper, but calmer. I opened the folder Alan had given me copies of the final audit summary. Across the top, in bold black ink, it read, "Misappropriation of Care Fund's primary guardian, Caleb Delgado." Seeing it in print didn't feel like victory. It felt like an obituary for the family we used to be. The next morning, I visited Rosa. She opened the door in her robe, surprised but smiling faintly. "Mija," she said, "you look tired." I kissed her cheek and helped her to the couch. The house smelled of chamomile and old wood. I handed her the envelope with trembling hands. "Mom," I said softly, "there's something you should see." She unfolded the papers slowly, her brow furrowing as her eyes moved across the words. When she reached the end, she pressed a hand to her mouth. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Caleb wouldn't." Her voice broke before she could finish. I sat beside her, holding her hand. "I didn't want to believe it either," I said. "But it's true." Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned toward the framed photo of us on the mantel, Caleb and me as children, smiling, arms around each other. "He was always so proud," she said quietly. "Always wanted your father to see him." I nodded, my throat tight. "He just wanted to be seen," I said. "And when he wasn't, he built a story where he was the hero." She cried, then soft, steady tears that seemed to wash years of denial away. I didn't cry with her. I'd done enough of that already. Instead, I held her hand until the storm inside her passed. When she finally looked at me again, her voice was hoarse. "What happens now?" I smiled faintly. "Now, Mom, we take care of each other. The right way this time." When I left, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled new. Across the yard, Javier was pruning his roses again, humming that same bolero. For a brief second, the world felt whole again, damaged but alive. I looked back at the house, the curtains fluttering softly, and whispered into the wind, "It's over, Dad. I did it." The days after the revelation felt strangely still, like the quiet that follows an explosion. The noise was gone, but everything had shifted. Rosa moved slower now, more thoughtful, her eyes softer when they met mine. She didn't ask for details about the investigation again. Maybe she already knew that knowing too much would only deepen the ache. I spent mornings at their house, cleaning, cooking, paying bills openly at the kitchen table so nothing would ever be hidden again. Javier nodded approvingly from his recliner as I showed him each printed receipt, each payment logged neatly into a binder labeled House Ledger. "You always were the organized one," he said one afternoon, voice thin but proud. I smiled. "Guess it's my turn to keep things straight." Caleb hadn't called since the meeting. Not once. The silence between us was thick, uneasy. Alan said the court had ordered temporary guardianship under my name until Caleb repaid the misused funds. There would be hearings, paperwork, maybe even penalties if he didn't comply. I didn't celebrate it. Justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like cleanup after a storm. Still, I needed that quiet space to breathe, to rebuild the parts of my family his lies had fractured. So I stayed calm, deliberate, steady. Revenge was no longer about punishment. It was about peace, something measured and final. One afternoon I sat with Rosa in the backyard, trimming Javier's roses. Together, the air smelled like soil and sun-warmed petals. She hummed softly, a tune I didn't recognize. "You know," she said after a while, "your brother called when your father got sick the first time. He sounded scared, like a little boy again." She paused, clipping another stem. "Then he started acting like he owned everything. Maybe that's how he fought the fear." I listened quietly. "We all fight fear differently," I said. "I ran from it. He tried to control it." She sighed. "And both of you forgot to talk to each other." I didn't answer. Some truths didn't need replies. That evening, I called Alan. "What happens next?" I asked. "We've scheduled the restitution plan," he said. "But Nora, there's something else. The court wants full transparency going forward. You'll need to attend the review in person." I agreed immediately. If Caleb had built this entire lie in public, the truth would be revealed in the same light. "Let him. Stand where everyone can see," I said. Alan hesitated. "You're certain you want to face him again?" "Yes," I said. I want him to see that the quiet one learned how to speak. Over the next week, I built a new system for Mom and Dad, simple, visible, honest. Every bill went into clear folders, every expense printed and filed. A whiteboard in the kitchen listed medications, doctor visits, and delivery times. "So we don't forget," I told Rosa, but she smiled knowingly. "So no one lies again," she corrected. She was right. Every visible note was a wall against the dark corners where deceit used to grow. Late one night, as I balanced the ledgers, an email notification appeared from Caleb. Just his name, no subject line. My pulse jumped. I opened it. "You won, okay? They believe you. Happy now?" That was all. No apology, no denial, just bitterness and defeat tangled together. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I typed a reply, slow and deliberate. "It's not about winning. It's about telling the truth while someone still can." I hit send before doubt could change my mind. The next morning, Alan confirmed that the final accounting hearing was set for Friday. "Bring everything," he said. "This will close it." I looked around the tidy house, every surface polished, every drawer labeled. For the first time, it felt like home again, not a crime scene. Rosa was in the kitchen humming softly, and Javier was watering the plants. The light through the window hit their faces gently, as if even the sun was tired of secrets. I picked up the ledger, straightened the pages, and whispered to myself, "Let's finish this properly." Friday came dressed in sunlight that felt almost too kind for what I planned to do. I woke early, made coffee, and laid everything out on the table. The ledger, receipts, photos, and the letter I'd written but hadn't decided whether to read. It wasn't a speech, just a confession of sorts, a quiet reclamation of what he'd taken. My hands didn't shake this time. They moved with purpose. I wasn't the wounded sister anymore. I was the witness, the protector, the one who'd finally learned that silence can be a weapon if you aim it right. Alan met me outside the courthouse, briefcase in one hand, his expression calm but alert. "Nervous?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "I've been nervous for years," I said. "Today I'm just done." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, intimate, almost claustrophobic. Caleb sat near the front, wearing another ill-fitting suit, his tie crooked, his face pale but defiant. When his eyes met mine, he smirked like it was still a game. But his hands told the truth. They trembled slightly against his lap. The judge entered, the clerk called names, and the air shifted. The moment had arrived. Alan spoke first, his voice measured and firm. "Your Honor, the petitioner, Miss Nora Delgado, has provided comprehensive documentation regarding the care and financial management of her parents, Rosa and Javier Delgado. The respondent, Mr. Caleb Delgado, was previously the primary guardian, but failed to file the required accounting reports." He gestured toward the evidence. "We submit proof of fund misappropriation and duplicate reimbursements." Caleb's lawyer, a young man with too much confidence and too little preparation, stood and began his rebuttal. "Your Honor, my client acted in good faith under pressure and without malicious intent. He provided care when his sister was," I interrupted softly. "Absent? Or silenced?" The judge raised an eyebrow. Caleb's lawyer faltered. Alan handed over the final audit. The judge flipped through, the pages whispering in the quiet room. "Mr. Delgado," she said, voice cool as glass, "these withdrawals, casino, personal dining, and duplicate reimbursements are documented under your signature. Do you deny this?" Caleb swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "I was reimbursing gas," he muttered. "The receipts just got mixed up." The judge leaned back. "They appear to have been mixed quite creatively." Laughter rippled faintly through the courtroom before dying into silence again. When my turn came to speak, I didn't read the letter. I didn't need to. "For years," I said, standing slowly, "I believed that family meant loyalty before truth. I sent money, food, care, all from another city because I trusted my brother to be honest. Instead, he built a story where I was the villain and he was the savior." Caleb's eyes flicked toward me, cold and cornered. "But truth," I continued, "doesn't need applause. It just needs daylight." The judge nodded slightly, then signed the final order. "Temporary guardianship to remain under Miss Delgado until restitution is complete. Mr. Delgado will be required to complete financial ethics training and submit to quarterly audits." The gavel hit. Wood, a soft sound, but final. It didn't sound like victory. It sounded like closure. Caleb stood quickly, face flushed. "You think this makes you right?" he hissed as I passed. I stopped just beside him. No, I said quietly. It just makes you seen. His lips parted, but no words followed. I walked out before the silence could grow cruel. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. Alan joined me, hands in his pockets. You handled that with grace, he said. That's rarer than justice. I smiled faintly, the wind lifting my hair. Maybe grace was the real revenge, I said. He chuckled softly. If so, you won. As we parted, I turned back toward the courthouse doors. Through the glass, I saw Caleb still standing, shoulders slumped, papers clutched in both hands. For the first time, he looked small, not because he'd lost, but because the truth had stripped him of the story he hid behind. I walked away then, not looking back again. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about ruin. It was about release, and I'd finally let go. The week after the hearing, I waited for something anger, guilt, satisfaction to settle inside me. But all I felt was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows truth when there's nothing left to argue. Still, justice alone wasn't enough. Caleb's lies had sunk deep roots, twisting through family and friends until they believed him more than they believed me. I didn't want revenge in court. I wanted truth in daylight, the kind that couldn't be whispered away, and I knew exactly how to bring it there. Alan had told me the restitution hearing would be public record. Anyone could request a transcript. That was my doorway. But I wanted more than paperwork buried in a file. I wanted people, the same people who had turned their eyes away from me at dinners and birthdays, to hear the real story, not just read it. That's when I called Marisol Grant, an old friend of Dad's who ran the local newspaper's community page. She answered on the second ring. Nora? It's been years, she said, her voice warm and cautious. What's this about? I took a deep breath. It's about setting something right, but I need your help to do it properly. We met the next morning at the cafe near the courthouse. She looked older, but just as sharp, her notebook already open before I sat down. I slid the court order across the table, along with a copy of the audit. I'm not after sympathy, I said. Just clarity. Marisol read in silence, her expression tightening with every page. He really told everyone you disappeared, she murmured. He said you never visited, never called, that you didn't care. I cared, I said quietly. He just made sure no one saw it. She looked up, her eyes steady. You sure you want this public? Once it's out, there's no pulling it back. I nodded. That's the point. The story ran a week later under public. The headline, Local Families Care Fund Misused, Daughter Restores Parents' Trust. It wasn't sensational, it was dignified, factual, and mercilessly clear. My name was in it. So was his. I didn't gloat when I read it. I just exhaled, long and slow. The same day it published, my phone buzzed nonstop calls, messages, half-hearted apologies from people who had believed him for years. A few relatives even showed up at Rosa's door with casseroles and pity. I accepted none of it, only asked them to treat my parents with the honesty they'd forgotten how to give. Caleb called 2 days later. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear his voice one last time, to see what shame sounded like when it finally broke. You humiliated me, he said, voice trembling. You could have handled it privately. I closed my eyes, the calm in my chest unwavering. You made it public first, I said. I just corrected the record. Silence stretched between 2,000 dividers. Us. Then his voice cracked. They all hate me now. No, I said softly. They just finally see you without the costume. He hung up without another word. That evening, Rosa sat with me on the porch, reading the article aloud in Spanish, line by line. La verdad siempre llega, she said, smiling faintly. The truth always arrives. Her hand rested over mine, fragile but steady. You brought peace to this house again, she whispered. Your father would be proud. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The garden lights flickered on, casting soft shadows over the rose bushes Javier had nursed back to bloom. Everything looked clean again, honest. But my plan wasn't finished. There was still one thing Caleb needed to face, not punishment, but understanding. I sent him an email that night with a link to the story and a single line beneath it. Come see them sometime, if you can do it without pretending. I didn't expect a reply. Instead, 2 days later, a delivery arrived at my parents' house, a box filled with receipts, signed checks, and a handwritten note. I'll pay it back. I'm sorry I made you the villain. No apology to me, no explanation. Just accountability. Raw and unpolished. That was enough. A week later, Alan confirmed Caleb had begun repayment. "You've done more than any court could," he told me over the phone. "Sometimes the real sentence is facing yourself." I thought about that long after we hung up. Maybe that's what revenge really is, not cruelty, but reflection, making someone see the mirror they've avoided. That Sunday, I cooked dinner for Rosa and Javier, just the three of us, like old times. The table was small, the conversation quiet. Rosa laughed when I spilled the rice, and Javier hummed along to a record spinning in the corner. The house felt warm again, not haunted by secrets. As we ate, I realized something simple and profound. The storm had passed, but the rain had taught me how to see clearly. When I drove home that night, the town lights shimmered against the dark. Somewhere out there, Caleb was rebuilding, maybe not as a brother I could trust, but as a man learning how to live without lies. I didn't need to forgive him yet. Truth had already done the healing for me. I rolled down the window and let the night air rush in, cool and endless. The world smelled like soil after rain, fresh, raw, and real. The article had done its work. The whispers that once stabbed at my back had turned into soft apologies. People who'd once looked away now stopped me on the street with cautious smiles and murmured, "You were right." But that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't need validation. What I needed was permanence, a way to make sure the truth couldn't ever be rewritten again. Caleb had spent years mastering the art of narrative. I'd learned mine from silence, but now I had the louder weapon. Proof. I started with something simple. The old family foundation. Account, the one our father had opened when we were children to fund kindness, as he called it, still existed untouched except for my small deposits over the years. I transferred the entire remaining balance to open the Delgado Care Trust, a transparent fund under both my and Rosa's names, meant to manage their medical and household needs. Everything was online, public, trackable. The launch announcement went live quietly on the same website that had covered Caleb's story. I didn't mention him. I didn't need to. The contrast said everything. Within days, local organizations reached out offering support. A reporter asked for a follow-up interview, and this time I agreed. We filmed in my parents' garden, Dad's roses blooming wild behind me. The interviewer asked softly, "Do you feel vindicated?" I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I feel balanced. The truth doesn't win or lose, it just finds its level." When the segment aired, people didn't talk about scandal anymore. They talked about what came next. That was the kind of revenge I wanted, one that replaced the noise with purpose. But Caleb wasn't done haunting me. One night, around midnight, my phone buzzed again. His name flashed across the screen, and against better judgment, I answered. "You've made yourself the saint," he said, voice low and bitter. "Congratulations." I stayed quiet, letting him speak. "Everyone looks at me like I'm a thief, like I killed someone." "You didn't kill anyone," I said. "You just killed what was left of our family's trust." There was silence, then the faint sound of him laughing bitterly. "You think Mom will ever forgive me?" he asked. I hesitated. "That's not my answer to give," he exhaled shakily. "She called me yesterday," he whispered. "Said she still loves me. I don't deserve that." His voice broke. "None of this was supposed to get that far." I closed my eyes. "Then why did you let it?" He didn't respond, just hung up. For the first time, I didn't feel rage, only exhaustion and something that almost resembled mercy. The next morning, I went to see Rosa. She was in the kitchen, humming while stirring coffee. "He called me," she said without turning around. "He cried, mija, like a child." She set the spoon down, her hands trembling slightly. "I told him he could come by next Sunday, but only if he was ready to be honest." I nodded. "That's fair." She gave me a long look. "You'll come too, right?" I hesitated. "Maybe," I said, "if I'm ready to hear it." Sunday came, wrapped in fragile sunlight. Caleb arrived early, standing on the porch like a stranger waiting for permission to exist. His clothes hung loose, his face thinner. Rosa hugged him first, tears slipping down her cheeks. Javier stayed silent but gave a small nod. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, unsure if I wanted to walk into that fragile truce. Caleb looked at me, guilt plain in his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I needed to see them." I stepped aside and gestured him in. "Then see them, not me." Lunch was quiet, careful. Conversation tiptoed around landmines. He talked about his new job, a modest accounting position at a hardware store, and how he was paying the restitution on schedule. Rosa listened, pride and pain mixing on her face. When he finished, I finally spoke. "You should have told me the truth, Caleb. I would have helped." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I didn't want to be helped. I wanted to be the one saving everyone." His honesty stung worse than lies ever had. Rosa reached for both our hands. "You're both my children," she said softly. "And you've both learned the hard way that love isn't measured in control or money." After he left, the house felt lighter, though fragile, like glass newly cleaned. Rosa sighed, looking out the window. "He's trying you." I nodded slowly. "So am I." That evening, I visited Dad's grave alone. The air smelled of rain and earth. I placed a single rose on the headstone and whispered, "It's done, Dad. The truth's back home." I didn't know if he could hear me, but the wind through the trees felt like an answer. Standing there, I realized the revenge had never been about Caleb at all. It had been about taking back my own name, my own story, about turning his lies into lessons, not scars. As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a new notification, an online donation to the Care Trust from someone anonymous. But I knew the handwriting in the small note attached, for Mom's medicine, from a brother learning to be better. I smiled through tears I hadn't expected. Maybe that was the real ending, not justice or punishment, but an imperfect kind of redemption. By autumn, the story had faded from headlines, but its echo remained. The Delgado Care Trust kept growing small donations, a few kind words from strangers who'd read about it months before. Rosa called it a miracle built from broken pieces. Sometimes I caught her humming when she balanced the budget notebook, tapping her pen against the edge like she finally trusted the world again. Caleb's name came up less and less, though every now and then she'd mention him softly, how he'd started visiting every other weekend, how he'd mow the lawn and fix the leaky sink without being asked. "He's quieter now," she'd said once, stirring sugar into her tea. Like a man who finally learned what silence is for. I didn't know if I was ready to forgive him, but forgiveness had stopped being the point. It wasn't about letting him off the hook. It was about letting myself breathe without bitterness. The town had long decided their version of the story, and for once, I didn't care what it was. The people who mattered already knew the truth. That was enough. One evening, I met Alan and Sophie for dinner, a quiet celebration of what they called a rare, happy ending. Alan raised his glass. "To honesty," he said, smiling faintly, "and to people brave enough to chase it." I laughed softly. "You make it sound like a sport." "It is," Sophie said. "And most people quit halfway through." I smiled, remembering the endless nights of paperwork, the courtroom air that smelled like dust and nerves, the weight of evidence pressed between my fingers. "Then I guess I finished the race," I said, "barefoot but standing." Alan chuckled. "Barefoot victories are the ones that last." When I got home that night, the answering machine blinked with a single message. Caleb's voice filled the kitchen, hesitant but steady. "Hey, it's me. Mom said you're working late again. I just wanted to say thank you for not turning them against me completely, for letting me try." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "I'm still paying things off. I'm still learning. But I see it now, the difference between helping and taking, between love and guilt." The message ended there. No goodbye. I stood listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator afterward, realizing that was the closest I'd get to an apology, and maybe that was okay. Weeks passed. The trees outside my apartment turned amber and gold, their leaves scattering across the sidewalks like old stories finally letting go. I spent afternoons at the Care Trust office, teaching volunteers how to track donations, managing forms, writing letters of thanks. It was calm work, the kind that builds meaning slowly. One afternoon, I received a small envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. Inside was a check for a modest amount and a short note, for Dad's garden tools. Thought he'd want the roses cared for. No signature, but I didn't need one. I smiled, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in the trust ledger under family contributions. The next Sunday, I visited Rosa and Javier again. They sat together on the porch, the afternoon sun painting everything warm. Caleb was there too, kneeling by the flower beds, dirt on his hands, humming softly. He looked up when he saw me and gave a small nod, no words, just quiet acknowledgement. I returned it. Rosa looked between us and smiled, the kind of smile that comes after years of waiting for peace. "You both came home," she said, finally. As evening settled, I stood by the garden, watching the sky fade into amber. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of what was broken. Instead, I felt what remained, the honest, fragile pieces that had survived the storm. Maybe that's what healing was. not pretending it never happened, but learning to live beside it without fear. I whispered into the soft wind, "We're all right now." Winter came quietly that year, blanketing the town in a hush that felt like forgiveness. The roses in my father's garden had gone, bare, their branches twisting like scars that somehow looked beautiful in the frost. Life had slowed into something steady, predictable, almost peaceful. Rosa's health had stabilized, Javier spent his afternoons painting again, and the trust fund operated without a single delay or missing cent. Sometimes I'd sit by the kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching the light stretch across the snow and think, this is what rebuilding feels like, quiet, not triumphant. Caleb kept his distance, but not his absence. Every few weeks he'd send receipts showing another payment toward restitution. He didn't include notes anymore, just facts clean, transparent, accountable. It was strange how numbers could sound like apologies when they were finally honest. Rosa spoke of him with cautious hope. "He's trying," she'd say, her voice soft. "He helps without asking for praise now." I'd nod, offering a smile that didn't reach my eyes but didn't need to. Some wounds heal. In silence, they just never close the same way again. In February, the local newspaper ran a small follow-up. The Delgado Family Fund reaches community milestone. It mentioned the trust's expansion into caregiver support programs, featuring families who'd been through similar betrayals. They asked to include a quote from me, something inspiring. I thought for a while, then wrote, "Love isn't about what you give, it's about what you protect." The editor printed it as the closing line. When I saw it in print, I smiled faintly. Not because it sounded wise, but because it was finally something I believed. One evening, as I was locking up the trust office, I found Caleb waiting outside in the cold. He looked older than I remembered, his face worn but peaceful. "Mom told me you'd be here," he said. I hesitated, searching his expression for the arrogance that used to live there, but it was gone. "What do you need, Caleb?" I asked softly. He held out a small envelope. "The last payment," he said. "It's done." I took it, feeling the weight of the paper between us less than an ounce, but heavy with years. "Thank you," I said simply. "You could have mailed it." He nodded, eyes on the ground. "I wanted to hand it to you myself. I didn't earn forgiveness, but I wanted to show I can finish something right." We stood there for a long moment, the snow crunching under our feet, breath fogging in the cold air. Finally, he said, "You were right about everything. I just didn't want to see it." I looked at him, this man who had once made me the villain in my own family's story, and I realized something unexpected. I no longer hated him. The anger had melted into something smaller, sadder, but cleaner. "You wanted to be the one they loved most," I said quietly. "But Dad already loved us both. You just didn't know how to believe it." His eyes shimmered. "Maybe now I can." He turned to leave, but before he did, he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on them. Or me." As his figure disappeared into the snowfall, I felt the cold sting my cheeks, but it didn't hurt. It felt real, alive. I looked up at the sky, flakes drifting down like soft confessions, and for the first time, I whispered his name not in anger, but in peace. "Good night, Caleb," I said to the quiet street. When I returned home, Rosa was waiting with 2 mugs of cocoa. She smiled knowingly when she saw my face. "You saw him," she said. I nodded. "He's trying." She reached across the table, touching my hand. "So are you," she said gently. "Maybe that's enough." Outside, snow blanketed the world white again. Clean, forgiving, endless. And somewhere in that quiet whiteness, I finally felt the truth settle. Not sharp, not burning, just steady. Revenge had been the spark. But forgiveness was the fire that kept me warm. Spring came slowly, like a promise being rebuilt one petal at a time. The roses bloomed again, red and full, their scent drifting through the open windows of my parents' house. Rosa loved to sit on the porch in the mornings, humming while sunlight warmed her shoulders. Javier painted again, his strokes steady and sure, each canvas brighter than the last. The quiet chaos that once filled this house had been replaced with rhythm, the gentle pulse of life returning to normal. I came by every Sunday, bringing groceries, sitting for coffee, and helping Rosa organize her recipes into a book she wanted to call Meals for Healing. Every visit felt lighter, as if the ghosts of lies had finally left these walls. One afternoon, while I was trimming the roses, Rosa said softly, "You look like peace, mija." I laughed. "That's new for me," she smiled. eyes glinting with love. "You've earned it." For the first time, I realized she was right. The anger that once lived in me had burned itself out, leaving something gentler behind. I wasn't waiting for Caleb's apology anymore, or for the town's approval. I was simply living. The Delgado Care Trust grew steadily through spring. Families started reaching out for advice on managing caregiving finances. I hosted workshops in the community hall, teaching people how to protect their parents, how to build transparency before betrayal had a chance to grow. Every face that came through the door reminded me why I'd done all this not for revenge, but for prevention. Every receipt, every document, every truth mattered. It was more than a fund now. It was a movement toward dignity. One evening after class, I lingered in the empty hall. The setting sun painted long, golden lines across the floor, and for a moment I heard my father's voice in my head, steady, kind, reminding me that love wasn't about being owed, it was about showing up. I smiled, whispering into the fading light, "I'm still showing up, Dad." Later that night, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done since before the storm began. I wrote about truth, how it doesn't destroy families, lies do. I wrote about Caleb, how some people have to lose everything before they can understand love. And I wrote about myself, the woman who once thought silence was safety, but learned that sometimes the only way to save what's good is to speak, even if your voice shakes. As I closed the journal, I realized I was no longer the sister left behind. I was the woman who stood up and reclaimed her family's story. I didn't need revenge anymore. I'd built something stronger in its place, peace with proof, love with boundaries, and a truth no one could steal again. If this story reminded you that speaking up can heal what silence hides, like, share, and subscribe for every heart learning that forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's choosing peace after the storm.